You must apologize!
An 8-year-old girl stands alone in an airplane aisle at 35,000 feet. Her name is Stephanie, and right now, she's the only thing standing between her mother and a flight attendant who's threatening to land the plane. Behind her, her mother, Dr. Vivienne Cross, sits trembling in her seat, hands pressed firmly over her ears, rocking back and forth. Passengers have their phones out, filming. The murmuring grows louder. The senior flight attendant, Brenda Whitmore, leans down towards Stephanie with barely contained anger. "This is your final warning," she says. "Control her or I'm having the captain land this plane." Stephanie doesn't move. Her voice is small but it doesn't waver. "You don't understand. My mom isn't doing anything wrong. How did an 8-year-old child end up protecting her mother at 35,000 feet? To understand that, we need to go back. Back to where this day actually started, 3 hours earlier. The morning had begun like any other travel day for Stephanie and her mother. The airport terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of early morning departures. Announcements echoed overhead. Travelers rushed past with rolling suitcases. Gate agents called out boarding groups. It was the kind of sensory overload that most people barely noticed anymore. But Dr. Vivienne Cross noticed everything. She stood near their gate, methodically checking their boarding passes for the 3rd time. Her fingers traced over the printed letters and numbers with precision. Then she checked them again. Her carry-on bag sat at her feet, organized with mathematical exactness. Documents in one pocket. Identification in another. Everything had its place and every place had to be verified. Stephanie watched her mother with the patience of someone far older than 8 years. She'd seen this routine hundreds of times. While other children might have grown frustrated or embarrassed, Stephanie simply stood close, a quiet presence of understanding. "Mom, we have 45 minutes, Stephanie said gently. "We're okay." Vivienne looked at her daughter, then at her watch. 43 minutes, she corrected. Security took longer than calculated. Stephanie smiled. She was used to her mother's precision. Used to the way she experienced the world in exact measurements and careful observations. To Stephanie, this wasn't strange. This was just her mom. As they stood together, a businessman in an expensive suit walked past, did a double take and stopped. "Dr. Cross," he said with genuine enthusiasm. "I didn't expect to see you here." Vivienne nodded acknowledgement, not quite meeting his eyes, her attention still partly on her mental checklist. "Excited for your keynote tomorrow?" he asked. "Prepared," Vivienne replied simply. The businessman smiled, nodded respectfully at both of them and continued on his way. As he passed, another traveler nearby recognized Vivienne and offered a subtle nod of respect. Dr. Vivienne Cross wasn't just any passenger. She was the CEO of Crosstech Industries, a leader in accessible technology innovation, a woman who'd spoken at the United Nations. But right now, in this crowded airport terminal, she was simply a mother trying to manage the overwhelming assault of noise, movement and unpredictability that air travel demanded. Stephanie noticed the way her mother's shoulders had started to tense. The way her breathing had shifted. The crowd was getting to her. Without being asked, Stephanie reached into her small backpack and pulled out a pair of noise-canceling headphones, holding them ready. She also checked that the fidget tools were accessible. Stephanie always came prepared. She'd learned young that her job wasn't to change her mother, but to help her navigate a world that wasn't built for the way her brain worked. "We should head to the gate," Stephanie suggested softly, her hand finding her mother's. Together they walked through the terminal, Stephanie gently guiding them through the sea of travelers, instinctively choosing the path with fewer obstacles, fewer sudden movements. The conference they were traveling to was important. Vivienne was delivering the keynote speech on innovations in accessible aviation technology. Ironic, considering what was about to happen. At the gate, first-class boarding had just been announced. Stephanie and Vivienne joined the line, their boarding passes clearly showing seats 2A and 2B. The gate agent greeting passengers was Brenda Whitmore, a senior flight attendant with 28 years of experience and a smile that had been practiced to perfection. That smile was bright and welcoming as she greeted the passenger ahead of them, a distinguished-looking older white man. "Welcome aboard, sir. Have a wonderful flight." But when Vivienne and Stephanie approached, something shifted. The smile remained, but it no longer reached Brenda's eyes. She looked at them, then at their boarding passes, then back at them again. "Can I see your boarding passes?" Brenda asked, holding out her hand. Stephanie noticed immediately that Brenda hadn't asked the passenger before them, or the one before that. But she handed over their passes politely, the way her mother had taught her to always treat people with respect, even when they didn't return it. Brenda examined the passes much longer than necessary, turning them over, checking the seat numbers twice, then looking back at Stephanie and Vivienne with an expression that seemed almost suspicious. "And you're both flying first class?" she asked. It wasn't the question itself. It was the way she asked it. The subtle emphasis on the word both. The slight incredulity in her tone. "Yes, ma'am," Stephanie replied, her voice matter-of-fact, betraying none of the discomfort she felt. Brenda scanned the passes and handed them back with a tight smile. "Enjoy your flight." It was a small moment. A tiny microaggression that some people might not have even noticed. But Stephanie noticed. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small warning bell began to ring. They walked down the jet bridge and onto the plane. Another flight attendant, a young Japanese-American woman named Yuki Tanaka, greeted them with genuine warmth. "Welcome aboard. Let me help you with that bag." "We're fine, thank you," Stephanie said, already helping her mother navigate to their row. Seats 2A and 2B. Window and middle seat in the second row of first class. Vivienne immediately began her routine. She checked the seatbelt mechanism, clicking it in and out, testing its strength. Once, twice, 3 times. Then she began arranging her items in the seat pocket with precise order. Phone here. Tablet there. Earbuds in this specific pocket. Other passengers were boarding now. An older gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes settled into the seat across the aisle. This was Richard Pemberton, a retired federal judge, though no one on the plane knew that yet. A few rows back, a middle-aged couple, the Holloways, were getting situated. Karen Holloway glanced forward, saw Vivienne and Stephanie, and immediately clutched her designer handbag a little tighter against her body, as if proximity to them somehow put her belongings at risk. Brenda had entered the cabin now, doing her pre-flight checks. Her eyes landed on Vivienne, who was still methodically checking her seatbelt, clicking it in and out for what was probably the 6th or 7th time. Brenda's jaw tightened. She watched for another moment as Vivienne carefully arranged and rearranged her items, then began walking toward them with purposeful strides. "Ma'am," Brenda said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the ambient noise of boarding. "You need to take your seat properly." Vivienne was focused entirely on her routine, on making sure everything was exactly as it needed to be. In her world, this concentration was necessary. It helped manage the anxiety. It created order in chaos. She didn't respond to Brenda's demand because she was already seated, already doing exactly what she needed to do, and the social expectation to stop everything and make eye contact with someone speaking to her simply didn't register as urgent. "She is sitting properly," Stephanie said, looking up at Brenda. "She's just making sure everything's secure." Brenda's tone sharpened further. "Is there a reason she can't answer for herself? Before you judge what happens next, I need you to understand something. Have you ever loved someone so much that you learned their language even when the world refused to? Drop your answer in the comments below." Stephanie felt that familiar protective instinct rising in her chest. The one that had been there since she was old enough to understand that her mother experienced the world differently, and that difference made some people uncomfortable. Made some people cruel. "She hears you," Stephanie said quietly. "She's just focused." The first seed of conflict had been planted. Brenda stared at them for another long moment, her expression making it clear that she'd already decided something about these passengers in seats 2A and 2B. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Stephanie with a knot forming in her stomach. The captain's voice came over the intercom, beginning the standard safety announcements. Vivienne's hands stilled on her seatbelt. She took a deep breath. Stephanie reached over and squeezed her mother's hand gently. "It's going to be okay, Mom," she whispered. But Stephanie was wrong. It wasn't going to be okay. In fact, in just a few short hours, Stephanie would be standing in that aisle, 8 years old and alone, the only barrier between her mother and a woman determined to treat them as less than human. If you want to see how an 8-year-old girl became a warrior at 35,000 feet, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because what happens next will change the way you think about courage, disability, and the power of unconditional love. The plane's engines began to roar to life. The engines grew louder as the plane began to taxi toward the runway. That deep, rumbling roar that most frequent travelers barely noticed anymore filled the cabin. But Vivienne noticed. She noticed everything. Her hands moved to cover her ears briefly, pressing against them to muffle the intensity of the sound. It was an automatic response, her body's way of managing sensory input that felt like too much, too fast, too loud. From a few rows back, Karen Holloway leaned toward her husband Dave, her whisper deliberately loud enough to be heard. "Is she going to do that all flight?" Dave didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The judgment in Karen's voice said everything. Stephanie heard it. She always heard things like that. Comments that people thought were quiet but weren't. Whispers that were meant to wound. She squeezed her mother's other hand and leaned close. "We're almost up, Mom," she whispered. "Just a few more minutes and it'll get quieter." The plane positioned itself on the runway. There was that moment of stillness, that brief pause before the acceleration, and then the engines roared to full power. The aircraft surged forward, pressing everyone back into their seats. Vivienne's grip on the armrests tightened until her knuckles went pale. Her eyes closed. Her breathing became measured, deliberate, a technique she'd learned years ago to manage the overwhelming sensation of takeoff. Stephanie held her mother's hand throughout it all, her thumb making small, comforting circles on Vivienne's wrist. "You're doing great," she whispered. "Almost there." The nose lifted. The ground fell away. The landing gear retracted with a heavy thunk that made Vivienne flinch, but she kept her breathing steady. Slowly, gradually, the plane climbed and the engine noise began to normalize. The intense roar softened to a steady hum. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Vivienne's shoulders began to drop from where they'd been hunched near her ears. Her grip on the armrest relaxed. Her eyes opened. She took one more deep breath and then finally she began to settle. The worst part was over. Stephanie watched her mother's face transform from tense concentration to cautious relief. "See," Stephanie said softly. "We made it." Vivienne managed a small smile for her daughter. That smile said what words couldn't quite capture. "Thank you for understanding, thank you for being here, thank you for not making me feel broken." About 20 minutes into the flight, the beverage service began. Yuki and Brenda emerged from the galley with the cart, beginning their way down the first-class cabin. Stephanie watched them approach row by row. She noticed the way Brenda's demeanor shifted depending on who she was serving. When they reached Richard Pemberton, the distinguished gentleman across the aisle, Brenda's voice was warm honey. "What can I get you, sir?" "Just coffee, please." "Black," Richard replied. "Absolutely. Would you like cream and sugar on the side just in case?" "That would be lovely, thank you." Brenda poured his coffee with care, placed it on his tray table with a napkin, and even included a small cookie. "Enjoy, sir." 2 rows back, she served the Holloways with equal pleasantness. "And for you folks?" "White wine for me," Karen said. "Beer, whatever you have on tap," Dave added. "Coming right up." Brenda's smile never wavered as she served them. But when the cart reached row 2, when it stopped beside Vivienne and Stephanie, everything changed. Brenda's professional warmth evaporated like water on hot pavement. She simply stood there, the cart blocking the aisle, saying nothing. Just waiting. Waiting for eye contact that she somehow felt entitled to demand. Vivienne was focused on her tablet, reviewing slides for her keynote presentation. She was in her element when she worked, her mind moving through complex technological concepts with ease. The social cue of a flight attendant standing nearby waiting for acknowledgement simply didn't register as something requiring immediate attention. She was working. She was focused. In her world, that was perfectly reasonable. Stephanie looked up after a moment. "May we have?" "I need her to order for herself," Brenda cut her off sharply. Stephanie felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her voice polite. "My mom would like water, please. No ice. And I'll have apple juice." "I'm going to need to hear it from her." Brenda's arms crossed over her chest. This was a power play. Pure and simple. And 8-year-old Stephanie recognized it for what it was. Vivienne, sensing the tension even without looking up, responded without shifting her gaze from her tablet. "Water. No ice. Look at me when you're speaking." Brenda's voice had taken on an edge that had nothing to do with customer service and everything to do with control. Vivienne's discomfort was immediate and visible. Forced eye contact was painful for her, not rude or dismissive but genuinely difficult. Her shoulders tensed again. Her fingers stilled on the tablet. She was being asked to do something that felt wrong in every fiber of her being, and she didn't understand why the stranger was demanding it. "She is speaking to you," Stephanie said, her voice quiet but firm. "She heard you." Brenda straightened up, her voice now loud enough that passengers in nearby rows could hear every word. "Some people need to learn basic manners." She grabbed a bottle of water, made a show of filling Vivienne's cup, and dropped 3 ice cubes into it with deliberate splashing. Then she set it down on Vivienne's tray table hard enough that water sloshed over the rim. The apple juice for Stephanie came next, delivered with considerably less aggression but still without any warmth. Across the aisle, Richard Pemberton had witnessed the entire exchange. His expression had shifted from pleasant contentment to a deep frown. He watched Brenda walk away, then glanced at Stephanie and Vivienne with something that looked like concern mixed with recognition. He'd seen this before. Maybe not on a plane but somewhere. The systematic dehumanization of people who didn't fit into someone else's narrow definition of acceptable. Vivienne stared at the water with ice cubes floating in it. She couldn't drink it like that. The temperature would be wrong. The texture would be wrong. But saying something, asking again, explaining again felt impossible in this moment. So she simply set it aside and returned to her tablet, trying to find that focus again, trying to return to the place where the world made sense. Stephanie said nothing. She just moved her mother's cup aside and quietly offered her own apple juice. Vivienne shook her head gently. It was okay. She'd wait. 30 minutes passed. The flight settled into that strange suspended reality where time feels both endless and compressed. Vivienne needed to use the restroom. It was a simple need, universal to every passenger on that plane, but for Vivienne it required mental preparation. Public restrooms were challenging enough. Airplane bathrooms, tiny and loud and full of unfamiliar mechanical sounds, were even more so. She took her small personal bag with her. It contained the items she needed, the tools that helped her manage. This was part of her routine, part of what made the experience tolerable. Stephanie watched her mother stand and head toward the back of the first-class cabin where the lavatories were located. There was a short line. One person ahead of Vivienne. She stood and waited, her bag held close to her body. And as she waited, she began her subtle self-soothing. A slight rocking motion, barely perceptible unless you were looking for it. A quiet humming, so soft it was almost inaudible beneath the ambient plane noise. These weren't conscious choices. They were her body's automatic response to stress, to waiting, to uncertainty. The lavatory door opened and Karen Holloway emerged. She saw Vivienne standing there, rocking ever so slightly, and her face contorted with something between disgust and fear. Karen didn't say excuse me. She didn't acknowledge Vivienne at all. She simply hurried past as quickly as the narrow aisle would allow and rushed back to her seat. Stephanie, sensing something was wrong, had gotten up and positioned herself where she could see her mother. She heard Karen's voice before she saw her. Dave, I don't feel comfortable with her back there. The words carried through the cabin like poison. And Brenda heard them. Brenda appeared from the galley like she'd been waiting for an excuse. She walked directly to Vivienne, her body language aggressive, territorial. Ma'am, you need to return to your seat. Vivienne looked at her, confused. I'm waiting for the restroom. You're making other passengers uncomfortable. Go back to your seat. Stephanie arrived just in time to hear this exchange. Her heart was pounding now, that protective instinct firing on all cylinders. She's just waiting in line like everyone else. Brenda whirled on her. Young lady, sit down right now. But Vivienne was already entering the bathroom, having waited her turn exactly as any other passenger would. The door closed and locked. And Brenda stood there, arms crossed, watching that closed door like a guard monitoring a prisoner. Inside the tiny lavatory, Vivienne went through her routine. She needed time. More time than a neurotypical person might need. She had to check things, arrange things, manage the sensory assault of the small space. 7 minutes. That's how long it took. 7 minutes that, on any other flight, with any other passenger, would have been unremarkable. But Brenda was counting every second. And at the 5-minute mark, she began knocking. Not gentle reminders. Aggressive, demanding knocks. Ma'am, others are waiting. There was no one waiting. The bathroom across the aisle was available. But that didn't matter to Brenda. This wasn't about bathroom efficiency. This was about punishment. When Vivienne finally emerged, she was visibly flustered. The knocking had added another layer of stress to an already difficult task. Her hands had begun to shake slightly, that telltale sign that her nervous system was becoming overwhelmed. She walked back toward her seat, trying to regulate her breathing, trying to hold herself together. Stephanie met her halfway, taking her mother's hand. She could feel the tremor in Vivienne's fingers. They made it back to their seats and Stephanie helped her mother settle in, speaking in low, soothing tones that only Vivienne could hear. But Vivienne was struggling now. The accumulation of stress, of confrontation, of sensory overload was building toward something dangerous. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small textured cube, a fidget toy designed specifically for people like her. It wasn't a gadget or a game. It was a medical tool as essential to her regulation as an inhaler to someone with asthma. She held it in her lap, her fingers moving over its various surfaces, seeking the tactile input that would help calm her nervous system. The quiet, repetitive motion was soothing. Necessary. Karen Holloway's voice cut through the calm like a knife. What is that? Is that allowed? and like a predator responding to a signal, Brenda swooped in. "Ma'am, all items need to be stowed." "It's just a fidget toy," Stephanie said, desperation creeping into her voice now. "It's not electronic." "I don't care what it is. Put it away." Brenda reached for the cube. Vivienne pulled back instinctively, protectively. This was hers. This was helping. Why was this woman trying to take it? "Do not make me ask again." Brenda's voice had risen now, drawing attention from every passenger nearby. Vivienne's breathing was quickening. Stephanie recognized the signs immediately. The rapid breathing, the increased rocking, the way her mother's eyes were starting to lose focus. This was how it started. This was the beginning of a meltdown, and if they didn't de-escalate right now, if her mother didn't get the tools she needed right now, it was going to get much worse. Stephanie reached for the noise-canceling headphones in her backpack. Her mother needed them. Needed them right now. And that's when the turbulence hit. The plane lurched suddenly, dropping what felt like several feet in a single stomach-churning instant. Overhead bins rattled. A few passengers gasped. The seatbelt sign dinged on with mechanical urgency. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Flight attendants, please be seated. We're experiencing some unexpected turbulence." But Brenda wasn't focused on the captain's orders. She was still standing over Vivienne, still demanding compliance, still asserting control. And Vivienne, trapped in her seat as the plane shook around her, was losing her grip on regulation with every passing second. Have you ever watched someone you love suffer while others refuse to understand? What would you do if you were Stephanie in this moment? Tell me in the comments. The turbulence intensified. The engine noise grew louder. The overhead lights flickered once. And Vivienne's hands moved to cover her ears as her rocking became more pronounced, more desperate. Her nervous system was overloading, firing every alarm, triggering every defense mechanism. Stephanie looked up at Brenda with tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Please," she said. "Please just leave her alone." But Brenda's face showed no mercy, no understanding, no compassion. The storm, both outside and inside the plane, was only beginning. And in the next few minutes, 8-year-old Stephanie was going to have to find a courage she didn't know she possessed. If you're invested in this story, if you want to see how one little girl stands up against injustice at 35,000 feet, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next will absolutely break your heart before it puts it back together again. The plane continued to shake. And Vivienne's control continued to slip away. The turbulence wasn't easing. If anything, it was getting worse. The plane bucked and swayed like a ship on rough seas. Overhead bins rattled with a sound like distant thunder. The seatbelt sign glowed insistently. And somewhere in the cockpit, Captain Gerald Thompson was focused on navigating through an unexpected patch of severe air turbulence that had appeared on absolutely none of his weather reports. But in Seat 2A, a different kind of storm was reaching its peak. Vivienne was experiencing what many people don't understand about autism, what most people never see because autistic adults have learned to hide it, learned to mask it, learned to suffer in silence rather than face judgment. She was experiencing complete sensory overload. Every sound was too loud. Every movement was too sudden. Every light was too bright. Her nervous system had gone into full fight or flight mode, except there was nowhere to fight and nowhere to flee. She was trapped at 35,000 feet in a metal tube that was shaking violently. Her rocking had become more pronounced now, more desperate. Her hands pressed hard against her ears, trying to block out the roar of engines, the rattle of bins, the murmur of frightened passengers, the mechanical groans of the aircraft fighting through turbulence. She was making soft sounds, little vocalizations that helped her body process the overwhelming input. To someone who understood autism, these were clear signs of a person in neurological distress. To someone who didn't understand, they looked like something else entirely. Other passengers were watching now. Some with concern. Some with discomfort. But most were simply confused, uncertain what they were witnessing. A businessman 2 rows back looked worried, not for himself but for her. An elderly woman across the aisle had her hand over her heart, her face sympathetic. But Karen Holloway had her phone out, recording. "This is unacceptable," she said to her husband, loud enough to be heard over the plane's noise, her camera pointed directly at Vivienne's moment of vulnerability. Stephanie was frantic now. She reached for the noise-canceling headphones, the ones Brenda had confiscated earlier. The ones her mother desperately needed. But they weren't there. They were gone. And without them, without that one essential tool, Vivienne had no way to reduce the sensory assault that was breaking her apart from the inside. "Mom, it's okay," Stephanie kept saying, her own voice trembling. "It's going to be okay. I'm right here." But it wasn't okay. And Stephanie knew it. She could see her mother disappearing into the overload, retreating to somewhere deep inside where the world couldn't hurt her quite so much. And then, despite the seatbelt sign, despite the captain's orders, despite the turbulence still shaking the plane, Brenda unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. Yuki, strapped into the jump seat, looked up in alarm. "Brenda, we're supposed to be seated," the captain said. But Brenda ignored her completely. She moved down the aisle with determined steps, gripping seat backs for balance as the plane continued to shake. She had decided something. And that decision was written all over her face as she approached row 2. Stephanie saw her coming. Saw the headphones in Brenda's hand. Her mother's headphones. The medical tool that had been taken and not returned. "Those are my mom's," Stephanie said, standing up despite the turbulence. "She needs them. Please." Brenda held the headphones up like evidence in a trial. "No devices during turbulence," she announced, loud and clear. "Those aren't electronic." Stephanie's voice cracked with desperation. "Give them back. Do not speak to me that way." Brenda turned and walked back toward the galley, taking the headphones with her, leaving Vivienne without the one thing that might have helped her regulate. And that's when it happened. That's when Vivienne's ability to hold herself together finally, completely, catastrophically failed. Without her coping tool, without her way to reduce the sensory input, Vivienne's regulation collapsed. The rocking intensified, her whole body moving now, seeking the proprioceptive input that might calm her nervous system. Her hands pressed so hard over her ears that her fingers went white. Tears streamed down her face, not tears of sadness but tears of pure neurological overwhelm. Her body was trying to process stimuli that felt like physical pain, and it was losing the battle. Stephanie stood in the aisle despite the turbulence still shaking the plane, despite the danger, despite everything. She tried to physically comfort her mother, tried to be the calm in the storm, tried to be what her mother needed when everything else had been taken away. "Someone needs to control that woman," Dave Holloway said, his voice carrying through the cabin. And that's when Richard Pemberton had heard enough. The distinguished older man stood up, gripping the seat in front of him for balance, and his voice came out firm and authoritative. "She's clearly in distress. Leave her alone." Karen turned on him, her phone still recording. "She's disrupting everyone. This is first class, not a what?" Richard cut her off, his tone sharp as a blade. "Finish that sentence. I dare you." Karen went silent, but the damage was done. The cabin was divided now. Some passengers sympathetic, some uncomfortable, all watching to see what would happen next. The turbulence began to subside. The shaking eased to occasional bumps. The plane stabilized. But Vivienne was still in the grip of her meltdown, still overwhelmed, still unreachable behind the wall of sensory pain. And Brenda was coming back. She walked down that aisle with the confidence of someone who believed absolutely in their own righteousness. "Ma'am," she said, standing over Vivienne, "I warned you. This is unacceptable behavior." That's when Stephanie did something that would take more courage than most adults could muster. She stepped directly into Brenda's path. Positioned her small body between this woman and her mother. 8 years old, barely 4 feet tall, standing up to an adult with 3 decades of authority behind her uniform. "Step back," Stephanie said, her voice shaking but determined. "Please. Move aside right now," Brenda demanded, "or I'm calling the captain." Stephanie looked up at her, this child who'd spent her entire life learning to advocate for her mother, learning to translate between her mother's world and everyone else's, learning to be brave when being brave was the only option left. "Then call him," Stephanie said. "Because you're making this worse." Passengers were recording now. Multiple phones out, capturing this confrontation. The whole scene playing out in digital documentation. A child protecting her mother. A flight attendant who'd crossed a line. And a woman in distress who'd done nothing wrong except exist in a body that processed the world differently. Brenda reached past Stephanie, trying to get to Vivienne. "Ma'am, you need to. Don't touch her." Stephanie's voice rang out, louder now, clearer. "Don't you dare touch her." The entire first-class cabin was watching. Every conversation had stopped. Every eye was on row 2. On this 8-year-old girl making a stand at 35,000 feet. And that's when another voice entered the situation. A voice that carried the weight of authority and moral clarity. "Flight attendant, stop." Richard Pemberton was standing again, and this time his entire bearing had changed. He wasn't just a concerned passenger anymore. He was something else. Something that made even Brenda pause. "Sir, this doesn't concern you," she started. "I'm a retired federal judge," Richard said, his voice carrying to every corner of first class. What I'm witnessing is discrimination against a disabled passenger under the Air Carrier Access Act. You need to step away from them immediately. Brenda's face flushed. She's not disabled, she's... My mother is autistic. Stephanie's voice cut through the cabin like a bell. She's having a sensory overload. The loud noises, the turbulence, the lights, everything you've been doing to her, it's all too much. Everything you're doing is making it worse. The words hung in the air. Autistic. Finally said out loud. The word that explained everything. The word that reframed every interaction that had happened since boarding. Silence fell over the cabin. You could have heard a pin drop despite the ambient engine noise. Yuki unbuckled from her jump seat and moved forward. I'll get the captain, she said quietly and disappeared through the cockpit door. What happens when the truth finally comes to light? When the person being discriminated against turns out to be someone powerful. Stay with me because this moment changes everything. It took less than a minute for Captain Gerald Thompson to emerge from the cockpit. He was a man in his late 50s, with silver hair and the kind of calm competence that came from 30 years of flying. He'd handled engine failures, severe weather, and medical emergencies. But as he entered the first-class cabin and took in the scene before him, his experienced eyes assessed the situation with the speed of someone used to making critical decisions. Brenda immediately launched into her version of events. Captain, this passenger has been disruptive since boarding. She's refused to follow instructions, made other passengers uncomfortable, and during turbulence she became completely. Gerald raised his hand, cutting her off mid-sentence. Let me talk to them first. He approached row 2 slowly, carefully reading the room as he moved. He saw Vivienne, still rocking, still in distress, tears still streaming down her face. He saw Stephanie, small and fierce, positioned protectively. He saw the other passengers, some recording, some watching with concern, all bearing witness. Gerald knelt down in the aisle, bringing himself to their level. His voice when he spoke was soft, gentle, nothing like the commanding tone he'd used with Brenda. I'm Captain Thompson, he said. Can you tell me what's happening? Vivienne couldn't respond. In this moment she was nonverbal, locked inside her overwhelming sensory experience, unable to organize words or thoughts beyond the basic need to survive the input. But Stephanie could speak. Through her tears, through her exhaustion, through her fear, she found the words. My mom is autistic, she said, her voice breaking. The loud noises, the turbulence, the lights, all of it, it's too much for her nervous system. She's not trying to cause trouble. She's not being difficult. Her brain just processes things differently than other people's brains. Gerald listened without interrupting, without judging, just listening with the kind of attention that told you he was really hearing every word. Stephanie continued, the explanation pouring out of her like she'd been holding it back for too long. She explained sensory processing, the way certain stimuli could be physically painful for her mother. She explained about the noise-canceling headphones that had been taken, the fidget toy that had been confiscated. She explained how every confrontation, every demand, every moment of conflict had escalated her mother's distress rather than calming it. She needed her tools, Stephanie said. She needed understanding. And instead, she got treated like she was doing something wrong just for existing. Gerald's expression was intent, focused, taking in every detail. And then Stephanie said something that changed the entire trajectory of what came next. My mom is Dr. Vivienne Cross, she said. She runs Crosstech Industries. She has 3,000 employees. She's spoken at the United Nations about accessible technology. She's brilliant. She's accomplished. She's amazing. She just needs understanding, not punishment. Gerald's expression changed. Recognition flickered across his face. Dr. Cross? He repeated. The Dr. Cross from Crosstech? He pulled out his phone, fingers moving quickly, pulling up a search. And there it was. Article after article. Dr. Vivienne Cross, CEO and founder of Crosstech Industries. Dr. Vivienne Cross, recipient of the National Technology Medal. Dr. Vivienne Cross, whose innovations in sensory-friendly airport navigation systems were being implemented in major airports worldwide. Dr. Vivienne Cross, autistic tech leader, advocate, and pioneer. Gerald looked at the phone, then at Vivienne, then at Brenda. You've been harassing, he said slowly, his voice carrying an edge now, one of the most respected technology leaders in the country. Richard Pemberton stood again, adding his voice to the moment. Captain, I've witnessed systematic discrimination since boarding. During beverage service, she was singled out and humiliated. During a routine trip to the bathroom, she was harassed. Her medical aids were confiscated. All of this is documented. He gestured to the passengers around him, many still holding up phones. Yuki stepped forward, her voice quiet but clear. She took Dr. Cross's noise-canceling headphones during the turbulence and refused to return them, even after being told they weren't electronic devices. "We have it recorded," said the businessman 2 rows back, holding up his phone. "All of it." "So do I," added another passenger. "And me," said a third. The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses were numerous. The discrimination was documented. And the person who'd been discriminated against wasn't some nameless, powerless passenger who could be dismissed or ignored. She was Dr. Vivienne Cross. And that changed everything. Do you think justice would have come if Vivienne hadn't been famous? If she'd just been an ordinary autistic woman? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this question matters more than you might think. Gerald stood up, his jaw set, his decision made. He looked at Brenda with an expression that contained disappointment, anger, and something that looked like sadness. Sadness that this had happened on his aircraft. Under his command. On his watch. "We need to talk," he said to her. "Now." But before he dealt with Brenda, he turned back to Stephanie. "Can I return your mother's belongings?" Stephanie nodded, and Yuki quietly retrieved the noise-canceling headphones from where Brenda had stashed them. She handed them to Stephanie with a whispered, "I'm so sorry." Stephanie gently placed the headphones over her mother's ears. The change wasn't immediate, but it was visible. Vivienne's rocking began to slow, just slightly. Her breathing began to regulate just a bit. The input was reduced. The world was quieter. She was being given the space to recover. And in that moment, as an 8-year-old girl comforted her mother with the tools that should never have been taken in the first place, as passengers watched with newfound understanding, as a flight attendant faced the consequences of her choices, and as a captain prepared to make things right, something profound happened on Flight 2847. The truth had finally, irrevocably come to light. If this story is hitting you in the chest, if you're feeling what Stephanie felt, that desperate need to protect someone you love, then hit that subscribe button. Because the resolution of this story will restore your faith in humanity. I promise you that. Captain Gerald Thompson stood in the aisle of his aircraft, a man who'd made thousands of decisions in his career, but few that felt as important as this one. He looked at Brenda Whitmore, a flight attendant who'd served with his airline for 28 years, and he made a choice that would change the rest of her career. "Go to the galley," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the absolute weight of command. "Now, you're relieved of first-class duties for the remainder of this flight." Brenda's face went pale, then flushed red. "Captain, I was just trying to maintain order. I was following protocol." "What you were doing," Gerald cut her off, his words precise and deliberate, "violates the Air Carrier Access Act and our airline's policies on disability accommodation. We'll discuss this further on the ground. But right now, I need you to go to the galley and stay there." There was no room for argument in his tone. No space for excuses. Brenda opened her mouth once more, then closed it. She turned and walked toward the back of the plane, her shoulders rigid with humiliation and anger. But she went. Yuki had already retrieved the noise-canceling headphones, and she approached Stephanie with them held out like an offering, like an apology made physical. "I'm so sorry," she whispered as she handed them over. "I should have said something sooner. I should have done something." Stephanie took the headphones and gently placed them over her mother's ears. The transformation wasn't instant, it was never instant, but it was real. With the auditory input reduced, with the world made quieter, Vivienne's nervous system began the slow process of regulation. Her rocking gradually eased. Her breathing deepened and slowed. Her hands, which had been pressed so hard against her ears, slowly relaxed. Gerald knelt down again, bringing himself to eye level with Vivienne, though he understood now that she might not meet his gaze, and that was perfectly okay. "Dr. Cross," he said softly, "I apologize. On behalf of this airline, on behalf of my crew, I apologize. We'll make sure you're comfortable for the rest of the flight. Whatever you need, you just let us know." Vivienne didn't respond verbally, she was still too deep in recovery for that, but she gave a small nod. It was enough. Gerald stood and moved away, giving her space, giving her what she'd needed all along. Respect. Understanding. Dignity. And then something remarkable began to happen. Something that often emerges from crisis when people finally understand what they're really witnessing. Community formed. Richard Pemberton moved to sit in the empty seat beside Stephanie. "May I?" he asked, and when she nodded, he settled in. "What you did," he said quietly, "that took incredible courage. You protected your mother when she couldn't protect herself. That's real love." Stephanie's eyes filled with tears again, but different tears this time. Relief. Exhaustion. gratitude that someone finally understood. She protects me every day, Stephanie said. She makes sure I have everything I need. She works so hard to make the world better for people like her. I just did what she's taught me. I stood up. A businesswoman across the aisle, who'd been watching the whole encounter, leaned forward. My son is autistic, she said, her own voice thick with emotion. He's 16 now, and I live in fear of moments like this. Of him being misunderstood. Of him being treated like a problem instead of a person. What you did was incredibly brave. You spoke up when adults wouldn't. You protected her. Another passenger, the man who'd been 2 rows back, held up his phone. I got everything on video, he said. Everything from the beverage service onward. If you file a complaint, if you need witnesses, I'll send it to support you. What happened here wasn't right. I have video too, another woman added. So do I, said someone else. The documentation was overwhelming. The witnesses were ready. The evidence was irrefutable. And then, surprisingly, Dave Holloway stood up. He walked forward slowly, his expression conflicted, ashamed. He stopped a respectful distance away. I'm sorry, he said, the words seeming to cost him something. I didn't understand. My nephew is autistic. I should have known better. I should have recognized what was happening. Instead, He trailed off, shaking his head. I'm sorry. Karen remained in her seat, silent, her phone put away now, her face turned toward the window. Shame has a way of making people small, of making them want to disappear. She didn't apologize. But her silence was its own admission. The atmosphere in the cabin had completely transformed. Where there had been tension and judgment, there was now understanding. Where there had been division, there was now community. Strangers were offering support, sharing their own stories, their own experiences with autism, with disability, with loved ones who needed advocacy. Stephanie sat with her mother's hand in hers, exhausted but relieved. Finally, she could focus entirely on what mattered. Helping her mother return from that place of overwhelming distress. Being present. Being the steady, loving constant that Vivienne needed. The rest of the flight passed in a kind of gentle peace that felt miraculous after the storm that had preceded it. Vivienne slowly came out of her meltdown. With her tools returned to her, with the hostility removed from her environment, with Stephanie's steady presence beside her, her nervous system gradually found its way back to baseline. It took time. It always took time. But with each passing minute, she came a little more back to herself. Yuki provided service that was respectful, attentive, and accommodating. She brought Vivienne water without ice, without being asked, with another quiet apology. She checked on them periodically, never intrusive, always kind. She was trying to make amends for her earlier silence, for not speaking up when she should have. Gerald checked in multiple times throughout the flight. He spoke with Richard, with the other witnesses, gathering information for the report he knew he'd have to file. But he also checked on Vivienne and Stephanie, making sure they had everything they needed, ensuring that the rest of their journey was peaceful. Richard spent much of the remaining flight talking with Stephanie. He told her about his career, about the cases he'd overseen, about the importance of standing up for justice even when it was difficult. Especially when it was difficult. You know what I learned in 40 years on the bench? Richard said. That the law only matters if people are willing to enforce it. If people are willing to stand up and say, this is wrong. You did that today. 8 years old, and you did what many adults wouldn't do. I was scared, Stephanie admitted. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Richard told her. It's acting despite the fear. That's what you did. Finally, about an hour before landing, Vivienne was calm enough to speak. She turned to her daughter, her eyes clear now, present, and she squeezed Stephanie's hand. Thank you, sweetheart, she said softly. Those 3 words carried the weight of everything that had happened. Thank you for protecting me. Thank you for understanding me. Thank you for being exactly who you are. Stephanie squeezed back. Always, Mom. Always. The cabin was quiet now. Peaceful. The way it should have been from the beginning. The way it could have been if understanding had been offered instead of judgment. The plane descended. The landing was smooth. And as the aircraft taxied to the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark. But the people in first class had been changed by what they'd witnessed. Some in small ways. Some in profound ones. But all of them carried something different off that plane than they'd brought onto it. At the gate, an airline representative was waiting. A man in a suit with an airline pin on his lapel and an expression of serious concern. He approached Vivienne and Stephanie as they came up the jet bridge. Dr. Cross, he said, I'm Martin Hayes, the station manager. I've already been briefed by Captain Thompson. I want to offer our sincerest apologies for what you experienced on this flight. It was a formal apology, carefully worded, the kind that legal departments approve. But there was genuine concern in his voice too. We take these incidents seriously. There will be a full investigation. We're offering you compensation, upgraded travel for future flights, and our assurance that this matter will be addressed. Stephanie looked up at him with those same eyes that had stared down Brenda Whitmore at 35,000 feet. We don't want free flights, she said, her voice polite but firm. We want training for your staff about autism and disabilities. We want them to understand that not everyone experiences the world the same way. We want this to not happen to someone else. Martin Hayes blinked, clearly taken aback by this 8-year-old's advocacy. He'd probably expected them to accept the compensation and move on. But Stephanie wasn't interested in moving on. She was interested in making change. He paused, recalibrating. That's a fair request. An important request. I'll bring it to our diversity and inclusion team immediately. You have my word. Richard stepped forward, pulling out his card. I'm a witness to everything that occurred on that flight, he said. I'm also an attorney, retired federal judge. If Dr. Cross decides to pursue this matter further, I'm available to provide testimony. He handed a card to Martin, then turned to Stephanie and handed her one as well. If you or your mother need anything at all, you call me. Stephanie took the card carefully. Thank you, Mr. Pemberton. For everything. Other passengers stopped as they passed, offering words of support, of encouragement. The businesswoman with the autistic son hugged Stephanie gently. You're going to change things, she whispered. Keep being brave. Vivienne, now outside the overwhelming environment of the plane, was returning more fully to herself. She stood straighter. Her voice was clearer. She thanked each person who'd stood up for her, who'd witnessed what happened, who'd offered support. This was her element now, outside the sensory chaos, able to engage with people on terms that worked for her brain. Thank you, she told them. Thank you for seeing me. For understanding. For being willing to stand up. They left the airport together, mother and daughter, hand in hand. And if you'd seen them walking through the terminal, you might have just seen an ordinary family. But they weren't ordinary. They were extraordinary. And they just fought a battle that too many people have to fight every single day. The next day at the technology conference, something beautiful happened. The conference center was packed, hundreds of people in the audience, all there to hear from leaders in accessible technology innovation. And the keynote speaker, the person everyone had come to see, was Dr. Vivienne Cross. Stephanie sat in the front row watching her mother take the stage. And if you'd seen Vivienne in that moment, you would have seen what Stephanie had always known. That her mother was brilliant, confident, powerful. In her element, on her terms, she was unstoppable. Vivienne presented her latest innovations in accessible technology. She talked about sensory-friendly airport navigation systems, about tools that help neurodivergent travelers, about the importance of designing technology that worked for all brains, not just neurotypical ones. Her presentation was flawless. Her knowledge was vast. Her passion was evident. And then, near the end of her speech, she paused. Yesterday, she said, I experienced something that many autistic adults face regularly. Discrimination. Misunderstanding. Judgment. I was in sensory overload on an airplane, and instead of receiving understanding, I was treated as a problem to be controlled. The audience was silent, listening intently. My daughter reminded me yesterday that advocacy starts with those who love us. She stood between me and ignorance with nothing but her voice and her courage. She's 8 years old, and she had to teach adults about dignity and respect. Vivienne looked directly at Stephanie. Being autistic doesn't make me less capable. It makes me different. And different perspectives drive innovation. Every tool I've created, every system I've designed, comes from understanding the world through an autistic lens. My neurodivergence isn't something to be fixed or controlled. It's my strength. The audience erupted in a standing ovation. Stephanie watched her mother, her eyes shining with pride. This was her mom. The brilliant, accomplished, amazing woman who just needed the world to meet her where she was instead of demanding she be someone she wasn't. After the presentation, they walked through the conference center together, hand in hand. People stopped Vivienne to congratulate her, to share their own stories, to thank her for her work. And Vivienne handled it all with grace, with confidence, with the ease of someone who was exactly where she belonged. Thank you for protecting me yesterday, Vivienne said to her daughter as they walked. Stephanie looked up at her mother and smiled. Always, Mom. Always. They smiled at each other, their bond unbreakable, forged through challenge and strengthened through love. An 8-year-old girl and her mother. A mother and her daughter. Two people navigating a world that didn't always understand them, but facing it together with courage and love and the kind of fierce protection that only family can provide. 1 in 36 children in the United States is diagnosed with autism. That's millions of people. Millions of families. And autistic adults face discrimination in travel, in employment, in daily life, simply for existing in bodies and minds that work differently. But here's the truth that this story shows us. Understanding costs nothing. Ignorance costs everything. Have you ever stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves? Has anyone ever stood up for you? Share your story in the comments because every story of advocacy, every moment of standing up, matters. It all matters. If this story moved you, if Stephanie's courage inspired you, if you believe that everyone deserves dignity and understanding regardless of how their brain works, then do me a favor. Share this video. Let it reach people who need to hear it. Let it reach other Stephanies who are fighting for their loved ones. Let it reach people who need to understand that disability isn't something to be feared or controlled, but something to be understood and accommodated. And maybe, just maybe, the next time someone sees a person in distress, they'll remember this story. They'll remember an 8-year-old girl who stood in an airplane aisle and said, "My mom isn't doing anything wrong." They'll remember that understanding costs nothing. And they'll choose kindness. Because in the end, that's what this story is about. Not just autism. Not just discrimination. But the simple, profound truth that we all deserve to move through this world with dignity. That we all deserve to be seen for who we are. That we all deserve love that protects us when we can't protect ourselves. Stephanie and Vivienne taught us that. At 35,000 feet, in the face of injustice, with nothing but love and courage, they taught us that. And that lesson is worth remembering. Always.